Hello, this is the Reverend Dr. David Chotka of Spirit Equip Ministries. Remembrance Day has been important to my family for a lot of reasons. Acts of remembrance help define us as nations. They give us national identity, and they teach us that no nation exists without the sacrifice of its forebears. Now, I never understood this as a young man, and it wasn't until I met an old man when I was just a young man that I began to get an understanding. You see, I met him at church, and I was in a study that he was in, and he had several favorite Bible scriptures, and he loved the old King James Bible. But he particularly loved Psalm 94, verse 22 from the old King James, and here's how it reads. But the Lord is my defense, and God is the rock of my refuge. So one day I asked him why he liked that text in which God is pictured like a rock. And he told me a World War II story. You see, he'd been a military commander in World War II. He was a colonel and oversaw a large contingent of soldiers. While leading a group of soldiers to take a piece of ground back from the Nazis after the Normandy invasion, the battle became fierce. He and a couple of other soldiers were sheltering behind a large boulder when suddenly a live grenade landed right between his feet. As soon as he saw the thing land, he knew he was a goner. And although he had never, ever lived for God before that moment, he cried out to the Lord and committed his soul into God's hands. Now, as that live grenade hit the ground between his feet, it immediately began to roll. It traveled just a few inches and wonderfully sank out of sight, going down underground into a gopher hole. It rolled a few more feet and went underneath the very boulder that was affording him and his two friends shelter from attack. Seconds later, the grenade exploded, and it lifted the boulder that he was leaning against 2 feet in the air, and it knocked him and his companions to the ground. Then, delightfully and wonderfully, everyone stood up alive. Suddenly, he realized 2 things. Number 1, life is short and he should have been dead. And number 2, a power greater than him had spared his life. He should have been dead. From that day forward, every time he saw a boulder, he would remember that unforgettable moment. And years later, as he was at a cenotaph, reflecting back on the war effort, he recalled to mind how he had been spared by the protection of a rock and saw in Scripture that God himself was called a rock of defense. And in that moment, he gave his heart over to Jesus Christ. November 11 became for him holy ground, something precious to him as his love for God grew. Every Remembrance Day, he would go to a stone of memorial. He would hear of the sacrifice of his peers and forebears, and there he would remember that God had in fact been the rock of his defense and his refuge. It would become for him a time to remember and to decide to serve God again. All of Scripture can be summarized in these 2 words: remember and decide. The theme pervades the Scripture from cover to cover. In fact, all through the Bible, those who loved God would set up altars or stones of memory. They would bring their children there and their children's children there and tell them of the God who led them through trial and trouble to a place of safety, with God as the rock of their defense. Remember what God has done. Decide to honor him in the way that you live. This is the Reverend Dr. David Chotka of Spirit Equip Ministries. If you'd like to receive a weekly blog, you can go down to the opt-in section in the www.spiritequip.com thing. Put your email information in there, and you'll receive a twice weekly blog. If you go to the YouTube channel, you could subscribe and receive these videos. May the Lord bless you in this time of holy memory.